Hey everyone! In this video, I want to talk about troubleshooting Cherwell MQS, RabbitMQ. This is the message queuing system that Cherwell shipped starting in, I believe it was 9.6. It might have been 9.7, but at least in 9.6, and has been shipping since then. Now, if you're used to 9.5, which is when the horizontal scalability was introduced, that actually shipped with something called ActiveMQ, which works a little bit different. But in this video, I'm going to talk about 9.6 and beyond, and what they call Cherwell MQS, but under the hood, it's really RabbitMQ. If you go searching on the internet for RabbitMQ, you can find it. It's an open source project. It's used by a lot of different projects to do basically what Cherwell is using it to do: distribute processing between multiple different services, sometimes even between multiple different machines. So there's really a lot in this video, and I'm going to go through it kind of quick. But if you have any questions about how the horizontal scalability portion of this works, how to apply it to your system, definitely watch to the end. This will cover basically everything in between the microservices. It won't actually cover what's in service host or anything like that, but everything that involves the communication between those microservices that lands in RabbitMQ. I'll also mention some gotchas and some tips on when it might be time to scale out. So the whole purpose of horizontal scalability was that you could run multiple, say, automation process services on multiple machines, that sort of thing. There will actually be a separate video specifically dedicated to how to scale out your system. There will actually be two videos on that. One specifically on the back-end microservices, basically everything in service host, and another one on all the front-end services, so how to do load balancing with the browser client and the application server and all that good stuff. So two separate videos coming in the next few weeks. But in this video, we're going to talk specifically about RabbitMQ. So let's get started. So to view the RabbitMQ admin console, go to the machine that you're running RabbitMQ on. Now in my case, I have everything installed on my laptop here, so I'm going to go to localhost. And in all likelihood, and for good reason, this administration console should not be accessible via the internet, basically outside the machine that it's running on. So if you only have a single Cherwell server, that makes it easy. Log into the Cherwell server and go to localhost. It's localhost and a port number, which I'll show in just a second here. If you're doing something a little bit more distributed, at some point in time you picked a single machine that was going to be the queuing server for your entire infrastructure. That's either a machine that you installed RabbitMQ on independently, or a machine that you installed Cherwell on and then decided that's what all of the other Cherwell servers were going to use. Now the Cherwell installer does install RabbitMQ under the name Cherwell MQS on every machine that you install the Cherwell server components or web components on. So just because you might have Cherwell MQS listed in services on your particular machine doesn't necessarily mean that it's the queuing server for your entire Cherwell infrastructure. So again, in my case, everything's installed on the same machine, so I'm logged into that machine and I go to localhost colon 15672. So let me zoom on that real quick. So 15672. So that's where you'll go to log into the RabbitMQ admin console. When Cherwell installs, it uses the username admin, and the password is also admin. Now, if that doesn't work, there were some cases where there was a hiccup in the installer. I think it was due to people installing and it not quite working and then trying to reinstall, and it encountered a hiccup when it was trying to install RabbitMQ. By default, RabbitMQ, Like if you went off to RabbitMQ's website and downloaded it by itself, it installs with the username and password guest, and that's actually a very special username that is only allowed to log into any part of RabbitMQ from the machine that RabbitMQ is working on. Obviously, in the interest of scaling, that's not going to work. So in Cherwell's case, we use the username and password admin. But if you can't log in with admin, try guest. If guest works, that's guest as a username and guest as a password. If that works, that's a problem. Go talk to Cherwell support or the partner that you're working with to make sure that everything's installed correctly. If it's using guest, it's also very likely that none of service host is running, so you might be running into some other issues there. But if guest works and admin does not, that's a known problem with a known solution, and we can get you through that. If neither of those works, then you need a complete reinstall. I'm not really sure what's going on there. That should never happen. But remove everything from that machine, including all of RabbitMQ, and reinstall Cherwell from scratch. As a side note, if you want to customize the user, if you don't want to use admin, which some of the more security conscious folks might want to change that username. Not that admin is insecure as long as it's only within your protected Cherwell network. But if you wanted to move to something a little bit more secure, if your security folks say, no, we can't use admin under any circumstances, okay, fine, that's a valid concern. There is a way to do that. Basically, what you do is log in with admin. So I'm going to click the login button here. And then you can go over to the admin section, users, add a user. Add a user with your desired username, password, and confirm the password, and then make them an admin. And make sure that all of the attributes of the current admin user get copied over to your desired new user that's going to be used for Cherwell. Now, if you do that, you do need to go into Server Manager and go down to Message Queue. You'll see it says Configured. Click Configure, and then change the user ID and password on every machine that needs to connect to this RabbitMQ server. So any machine that you have Cherwell installed on that's going to use this queuing server that you just added a new user to, you need to go into Server Manager and change that authentication information. So I want to leave it admin. That's fine for my use case, but you might want to change it. And if you do, that's how to do it. So now let's go back to the Overview tab, and you can see not a whole lot is happening. And you can actually dive into some of these other things. Connections, okay, no connections. Channels, no channels. Exchanges, you'll notice a few here. These top several, what is that, 7, I believe show up out of the box. So right when you install Cherwell and RabbitMQ, even before running anything, those first 7, everything but the very last one there, will show up. If that's all you see, that means Cherwell has never run on this machine, Service Host has never connected to this RabbitMQ instance, and none of your services are operating. If you see this last one down here, that means that Service Host at one time did try to connect to RabbitMQ and may have done some stuff, but at this point in time it is completely shut down. So let's see what happens when we start Service Host. So I'm going to go down to Services here and go down to Service Host, so it shows up as Cherwell Service Host. And remember, I said RabbitMQ shows up as Cherwell MQS. That's what that looks like. So I'm going to start Cherwell Service Host. So click that, start the service. Give it a few seconds. And now, if we go back to this Exchanges tab, you'll notice a few more exchanges. This means that service host is running. And in fact, if we go over to the queues tab, you'll see a lot of queues here. And while I have this page up, let me go ahead and stop service host so you can see what that looks like. So select service host, stop the service, and we'll go back here and notice that the number of queues has significantly decreased. So it looks like we basically have 1 or 2 for every single microservice that runs as part of service host. But then if we start service host again, we also have a few more. So in 5 seconds it'll refresh, and we have about double the number of queues. And depending on your particular load, how many automation processes you're running, how many emails you're sending, how many email and event monitors you have, you might see a big long list of queues, more than just what I have here. This is again, this is my laptop. I don't have a whole lot going on here, so you can see some of these message rates are fairly low. It's basically just the messages that tell things to spin up and see if there's something to do, which of course there's not, because this is my dev machine. Alright, so RabbitMQ is a queuing system, which, if you're familiar at all with how queues work, basically there's a producer and a consumer, and the queue facilitates asynchronous communication between the two. The producer creates a message, drops it on the queue. A consumer picks it up off the queue in, first out order, and does something with it, and either it acknowledges that it handled the message, in which case the queuing service basically forgets about the message, it's done, it doesn't need to do anything with it anymore, or it doesn't acknowledge the message or reports an error, in which case the queuing service either holds on to the message, keeps it on the queue, and waits for another consumer to ask for that message, or in the case of an error, it might do something else with it. Cherwell isn't that involved. It's basically just something gets dropped on the queue, a consumer picks it up, and that's how it's supposed to work. But if things are going wrong, let's say you are expecting a bunch of emails to go out and they're not. One thing that you might see is on some of the email and event message, or on the email and event message queue, you might see there are a bunch of ready messages or a bunch of unacked. That means unacknowledged. That means a consumer has picked them up, but it hasn't acknowledged that it's completed them yet. And the total is going to be high. For instance, that might be something, which means that either the consumer is going really slowly, maybe it's having trouble connecting to your email account, your outbound email account, so the queue is just backing up, or something else is going on. Network connectivity. Maybe it's running into errors, and in that case, you might want to look at some of the logs, the service host logs. But this screen right here is a great troubleshooting screen, and basically, if all of these numbers are 0 or really close to 0, or if you never have a 0 baseline, whatever your baseline is, right? So if you send 10 messages a second, you might expect to see this number hover around 10. Maybe it'll be down around 8. Maybe it'll go up to 12. But as long as it hovers around 10, everything's okay. And as soon as it goes up to 300, or if it continues to grow beyond 300 to 400, 500, then you know that something's wrong. And what is wrong? There could be a myriad of different options there. Another good thing to see on this screen is you can click this button and add columns and choose consumer count. And you'll see consumers here, right? And you can see email and event message. I've got 5 consumers. I'm not really sure why that is. Since this is not a production machine, I'm not super worried about that. But if I started seeing that this number was, say, 500, that might be cause for concern. Or if I knew that I had, a ton of email going out and a ton of, I'd intentionally scaled up the email and event sorry, this is not outbound email, this is inbound email. If I knew that I had a bunch of service hosts running email and event monitor, and I only saw 2 consumers here, that might be cause for concern. And then it's kind of just a sanity check, right? If you have 5 machines that are supposed to be running email and event monitor, you know you should see at least 5 consumers, probably at least 10 or 20 consumers based on the, the virtual process multiplier and that sort of thing. So that's another useful thing to look at. Now, when it comes to consumers and producers in Cherwell, you may have heard the term leader and worker. In general, what that means is basically the leader is the producer, basically looks at the SQL database and figures out what work needs to be done and queues it up for a specific consumer, or in Cherwell's terminology, worker, to handle. So there are other, more advanced messaging systems. You may have heard of Apache Kafka that handles things through partitions. If you haven't heard of that, don't worry. You don't need to know Kafka because Cherwell, at least right now, doesn't use Kafka. But to handle kind of the same thing that Kafka does with partitioning, Cherwell uses a leader which hands out work to a specific worker. So that's why you'll see multiple consumers, even if you're only running service host on a single machine. You'll also see the producer process is reading the SQL database and putting messages onto the queue. Yeah, so we talked about messages, ideally as close to 0 as possible, or whatever your baseline is. And it's okay if it bursts. Let's say all of a sudden you're sending a bunch of emails. It's totally okay if the message queue goes up to 300, as long as it starts creeping down after the burst or the spike is over. If it doesn't go down, that might be cause for concern. If it continues to go up, that also might be cause for concern. The 2 main possibilities are either you're running into errors or you're not scaled out adequately. So you just don't have enough processes running to handle the load that you're dealing with. And if that's the case, again, check out a video coming out either next week or the week after, where I'm going to talk about how to use service host to scale out horizontally, so that you can handle whatever load you're dealing with. So let's see other things. So let's dive into a queue. Let's dive into this one right here. So these graphs are basically graphs of some of the statistics that we saw on the last screen, and in fact those statistics are on the right side here. One thing is that message rates. This is good to see kind of the 30,000-foot view of how many messages are coming in, how many messages are going out, and what is the kind of the load on the queue at any given time. This chart up at the top is the total number of messages that are currently in the queue, how many of them are being processed versus ready. So unact is how many are being processed, ready is they are in the queue, they are waiting for processing. And again, this is where you might see a huge spike, and if that spike resolves, everything's good. If that spike never resolves, if it stays high, that's bad. If it continues going up, that's also bad. All right, now let's get into gotchas. One gotcha, RabbitMQ is not Kafka. So if you're thinking about this in terms of Kafka, don't. Kafka is way more sophisticated. It's designed to solve a different problem than a queuing system, and Kafka has a lot of cool features. I've been reading about Kafka, watching some videos about Kafka over the last few months. I really want to find a problem that I can use Kafka to solve, but honestly, it's designed for a very specific type of problem, and RabbitMQ is really designed for this type of problem. So RabbitMQ is really well suited for this scenario. but it does operate different from Kafka. So if you're thinking this works like Kafka, don't. So another one, RabbitMQ is not the source of truth, but don't rely on the leader to always requeue messages. So, basically be careful about shutting down RabbitMQ. Some of these queues are durable. So if you go back to the queues page, you'll see, let me close this, you'll see Ds next to some of these. That means they're durable. That means that if you stop RabbitMQ, or if the consumer or producer drops off, the queue stays around. These ADs mean auto delete. That means if there's nothing in the queue and there are no producers and no consumers, the system just removes the queue. It just goes away, cleans up after itself. So what does that mean that RabbitMQ is not the source of truth? The SQL database is absolutely the source of truth. So that's what the leader looks at to queue up messages for the workers to work, and that's what everything else in the system is based on. So even if something is queued in RabbitMQ, let's say an outgoing email, if it's queued in RabbitMQ, but it isn't marked as sent in the SQL database, the system won't treat it as sent. It's as simple as that. Now, it looks like there were some changes over the course of some of the more recent versions to ensure that nothing got lost. So if you sent an email, got saved to the database, got queued up in RabbitMQ, and then you shut down RabbitMQ or shut down service host before it had a chance to send it out, I believe there were some versions where that email just would never get sent out. It looks like now in more recent versions, that's not the case. As soon as service host spins back up again, that message will still be on the queue in RabbitMQ, and that message will get sent out again. I haven't actually tested that theory, but looking at the configuration, I believe that's the way it's set up right now. So leave a comment below if you have firsthand experience with that. I'd love to hear your stories and know exactly what's happening there. All right. The next gotcha is Cherwell doesn't use RabbitMQ like an event bus. Queuing systems are very common in largely distributed, not operating systems, largely distributed microservice-based systems as an event bus. So one microservice does something and it sends an event out to the event bus and says, hey, I did a thing. And who knows if anyone's listening. If someone is listening, they might do something with it. If no one's listening, no one does anything with it. That's not how Cherwell uses RabbitMQ. Cherwell uses RabbitMQ more like hub and spoke communication between the kind of the centralized, CSM core application server, browser client, those kind of core services to farm out tasks to the microservices with the help of the leader. So this is very task oriented. A task gets queued up rather than just an event getting fired and queued up for any number of potential listeners. So that might be a little bit different from how you may have used queues in the past. Another thing is it's a lot easier to troubleshoot issues under low load rather than high load. So obviously, definitely the goal is to be able to scale this out, as big or bigger than your data needs require. But if you're running into a particular issue, I definitely recommend starting with one service host running the service that you're trying to debug on one machine and no other machines. Don't have any other service hosts running. Just have that scenario so that you know that any message you send out is going to go to that service host. It's going to log to that service host's log, and it's going to be a lot easier to track down the issue. And I say this even if you have a log aggregator that all of the service hosts are writing to. It's still a lot easier if you don't have all the noise from other service hosts, other things running, other load on the system. It's just a lot easier if you can really break down the problem to only the critical components of the issue, and kind of watch the messages go through the system. So when is it time to scale out? One time that it's time to scale out is when the number of messages during a spike doesn't decrease back to the baseline or 0, if your baseline is 0, within a reasonable time after the spike occurs. And when I say reasonable time, what that means is really up to you. So, 10 minutes might be reasonable with your operational concerns. 3 hours might be reasonable. 24 hours might be reasonable. It really depends on what your expectations and requirements are. If you have an SLA that's minutes, obviously a spike being resolved within a couple hours probably isn't going to work. So you might say, if the spike doesn't resolve at 5 minutes, we need to scale out more. And that's totally up to you. Whatever those benchmarks and thresholds are is completely organization dependent. The other time it's time to scale out is when baseline continues an upward slope. This just means that you don't have enough resources or service hosts scaled out currently to handle your baseline. And this just means that you don't currently have enough service hosts set up to handle your baseline, and so your normal throughput of messages is backing up. So if you're experiencing that, then try adding one more service host. If your baseline isn't decreasing, then add another service host. If you already know that you're going to need more than that, maybe just double the number of service hosts or something like that. But really, if your slope is going up, bad news. If your slope is not coming down fast enough after a spike, also bad news. Both of those times, time to scale out, as long as no other errors are happening. So if other errors are happening, then obviously look at those first. And when it comes to how to scale out, there will be a video coming either next week or the week after on how to set up service host on multiple machines so that you can scale out and handle potentially infinite load, as much as your leaders can handle. So with that, that's going to conclude this video. It's kind of a long one, but there's a lot of information here. If you have any questions about anything I talked about here, or anything that you want to see in either of those two videos that I'm going to do on scaling out the front end or the back end microservices, leave a comment below. Ask your question there. I might not answer it there, but if I don't answer it there, I will answer it in the videos. And hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.